welcome back for our session with Shashi Tharoor. He speaks on the vision of Rabindranath Tagore. The special discussant here is Debashis Sen. The session will be moderated by Anjum, Katyal. Shashi Tharoor is an author, politician, and former international civil servant. Dr. Tharoor is currently a third-term Lok Sabha MP representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency and chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology. He has previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs, Government of India. During his prior career at the United Nations, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, and administrator at the highest levels, serving as Under Secretary General during Kofi Annan's leadership of the organization. Welcome, Dr. Tharoor. Debashis Sen is a senior IAS officer with a diploma in public administration from ENA, France, and training at JFK School at Harvard University. He has received the Jewel of Bengal Award for outstanding contribution to public administration. His innovation, Anandababu, became an icon in electoral communication. His use of blockchain in birth certificates was a trendsetter. In governance and his contribution to Township Policy of Government framework of the country became the same for new cities. He is presently posted as Chairman, Managing Director, HIDCO, which is a government company that is developing smart city of New Town, Kolkata. He is passionate about sustainable development, circular economy, and inclusive communities. He is also the chairman of Naba Diganta Industrial Township Authority, NDITA, at Sector 5, Salt Lake, where he is creating a green city. Anjum Katyal is a writer, editor, translator, and critic. She is the author of Habib Tanveer, Towards an Inclusive Theatre, Badal Sharkar, Towards a Theatre of Conscience, and Safdar Hashmi, Towards Theatre for a Democracy, which will be forthcoming, this title. She's been chief editor of Spiegel Books, Calcutta, 1987 to 2006, and editor of Spiegel's Theatre Quarterly, 1994 to 2004. She has translated works by Habib Tanveer, Mahashweta Devi, and Meera Mukherjee. A published poet, she also sings blues and reviews and writes on theatre and the visual arts. She is currently the curator, New Festival, Shantiniketan. Over to you, Anjum and the panelists. Welcome to New 2021.
So let me welcome you very, very warmly, Shashi. Thank you so much for joining Nabanna Earth Weekend 2021, despite the fact that you are actually recovering from the effects of COVID-19. I mean, we really appreciate it that you kept to your commitment and you actually showed up here today. Thank you so much. Next year, or maybe the year after, if all goes well, inshallah, we shall have you actually in Shantiniketan, speaking as part of the festival. This year, we are making do with a virtual festival. So may I invite you to please begin your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anjum. It's really a pleasure to join this distinguished gathering at the Nabanna Earth Weekend Festival, even virtually, and to share my thoughts on the vision of the immortal Gurudev, Rabindranath Tagore, his ideas and values. I must confess that when you, as festival curator, invited me to speak at this year's edition, I was happy to accept, only regretting that COVID-19 has made it impossible to deliver my address from the abode of peace, Shantiniketan, a place I have not had the good fortune of visiting yet. After all, what better place to speak of the Gurudev and the eternal legacy he's bequeathed to us. But my own bout with the virus has meant that I'm not well enough to travel anyway, and I'm actually only speaking to you as my first public engagement in the last 5 weeks on a brief furlough from my ongoing bed rest ordered by my doctors. The fact that we've been forced to meet virtually is only but a milder manifestation of what has surely been one of the most challenging periods in our nation's contemporary history. In these last few months, all of us have faced either directly or indirectly some amount of irreparable personal loss, deaths in our closest social circles, the suffering of loved ones, separation from those who act as our support systems, the mental anxiety and trauma from seeing what our communities are going through, and the frustration of feeling powerless in the face of these seemingly insurmountable challenges. But perhaps above all else, the destruction caused by the pandemic has not just forced us to rethink our lives and our ways of living, but has made us all ask questions of ourselves and of our own humanity. In thinking of such questions, one inevitably thinks of Tagore in the middle of a pandemic. And I was naturally reminded of the course of action followed by the two brothers, Jagmohan and Harimohan, in Tagore's timeless classic, Chaturanga, published over a century ago in 1916, and yet of striking relevance in today's difficult times. Set in Calcutta in the thralls of the plague that struck the city in the late 19th century, their contrasting tales offer lessons worth reflecting on. On the one hand, the more humanitarian and empathetic sibling, Jagmohan, refuses to flee the plague-ravaged city with his brother, for that would have meant abandoning the tanners in their locality. All of whom belonged to a different community and subscribed to a different faith, who would have been forced to fend for themselves. The less altruistic brother, Harimohan, perhaps understanding wisely the gravity of the situation, assesses the scenario differently, and in the interest of survival, vacates the city in time, even as it ultimately engulfs the life of Jagmohan. To my mind, it seems to be the case that those who we expected to act in the same compassionate spirit that Jagmohan channeled, those in our leadership who had the power and duty to act as a barrier between the virus and the people of the country, ultimately chose the same path of self-preservation that Harimohan adopted, leaving others to fend for themselves. And yet, if there is any silver lining amidst all the chaos that has ensued, it has come in the form of thousands of ordinary citizens who had no duty or need to go beyond their immediate needs, but who rose up all across the country, and just as Jagmohan did, rallied together to ensure that calls for help from strangers were answered. Novellas like Chaturanga and lyrics like Tagore's famous Puraton Nritya, which poignantly captured the ultimate sacrifice made by Keshto as a result of her unwavering care for her master, who catches the dreaded smallpox virus, offers perhaps a more literal link between the Gurudev's evergreen lessons and our contemporary times. And yet, while these offer timely resonances, it is important for us to remember that Tagore's greatness is not restricted to the contemporary relevance alone. It's not an easy task to capture the scale of Rabindranath Tagore's accomplishments. Some have made glib comparisons to Shakespeare and Goethe, but neither man, despite his undoubted greatness, excelled in as many fields as the Gurudev, nor dominated his culture to the extent that Tagore did his. Think of it. He was not merely an extraordinary poet, the only Indian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913 for his Gitanjali, profoundly moving verses written in Bangla in 1910 after he had lost his father, wife, second daughter, and youngest son. He was also a prose writer and essayist of the first rank, whose articles, books, and monographs commanded a wide readership around the world. As a philosopher, he was perhaps the first to develop a synthesis of Eastern and Western approaches, and he developed political ideas of great depth and humanity, which I'll come back to later. He was a great and uneven novelist and short story writer who produced several masterpieces that continue to be read a century and a half after his birth. His Kabuliwala is amongst the few short stories most Indians remember from their childhood. He was also a playwright of rare distinction. The Post Office, for instance, was one of the most popular plays in the world before the Second World War. But added to all that were his other remarkable talents. He was a painter of high quality and perceptiveness, an artist with a poet's eye. He was a composer of over 2,000 immortal songs, of which he authored both the lyrics and the tunes, and through which he essentially founded his own discipline of Indian music, known, of course, as Rabindra Sangeet. He's the only person to have created the national anthems of two different countries, India's Jana Gana Mana and Bangladesh's Amar Shonar Bangla. Both nations were born after his own death, and he inspired the composer of Sri Lanka's anthem as well, who translated Tagore's lyrics and set them to Tagore's music in a tribute to his mentor. As if all this were not enough, he was an educator of great vision and courage, founding Vishwabharati University at Shantiniketan to offer an authentically Indian experience of higher education, following systems and approaches of his own devising. It educated the likes of Satyajit Ray and Indira Gandhi, not to mention offering a cradle to Amartya Sen, whose first name, with its evocations of immortality, was given by Tagore. Probably the only instance of a Nobel laureate baptizing another. If all this were not more than extraordinary, representing a level of achievement so towering that it's difficult to imagine an individual in any other culture who comes even close, there is also the remarkable fact of Tagore's huge worldwide impact in his own time. Tagore was a global giant before the era of globalization. When he was to speak at New York's 4,000-seat Carnegie Hall in 1930, itself a rare enough honor since the hall is usually reserved for concerts, not orations. More than 20,000 people were turned away from the sold-out event, creating a mass of humanity on the streets outside that blocked traffic for miles. No living writer on the planet had ever had something comparable happen. And what's more, Tagore was handsomely paid for his speeches. One American critic, not without a tinge of jealousy, wrote acerbically that the Indian scolds Americans at $700 per scold. But to their standards, that would be more like $17,000 per scold, perhaps $70,000 in purchasing power terms. Now, Tagore himself was modestly dismissive of his fame and the attention it got him. Quote, "The perfect whirlwind of public excitement the Nobel Prize has given rise to is frightful," unquote, he wrote to his friend, the artist William Rothenstein, in 1913. "It is almost as bad as tying a tin can to a dog's tail, making it impossible for him to move without creating noise and collecting crowds all along," unquote. 8 years later, he confided to Edward Thompson, quote, "What an immense amount of unreality there is in literary reputation. And I'm longing, even while appreciating it like a buffalo the luxury of a mud bath, to come out of it as a sannyasi, naked and aloof," unquote. Like all fine writers, Tagore had a rare gift of phrase. His description of the Taj Mahal as a teardrop on the cheek of time can scarcely be bettered. And which poet would not want to have authored his line, "Who can strain the blue from the sky?" His descriptions of nature are startlingly original and thought-provoking in their imagery. "The rose," he wrote, "is a great deal more than a blushing apology for the thorn. Dawn is the departing night's kiss on the closed eyes of morning. A picture is a memory of light treasured by the shadow." Exquisite. Sometimes his metaphors are explicitly metaphysical. In the mountain, stillness surges up to explore its own height. In the lake, movement stands still to contemplate its own death, he wrote. He lent to spirituality a literary succinctness few others could master. Life is given to us, we earn it by giving it. Or the poignant, "And because I love this life, I know I shall love death as well." His stories and letters overflow with literary gems, each bearing an insight thoroughly steeped in Indian tradition. While God waits for his temple to be built of love, man brings stones. Or, quote, he who does good comes to the temple gate. He who loves reaches the shrine, unquote. And darkness travels towards light, but blindness towards death. This was also true of his more social reflections. Nowadays, men have acquired what God did not choose to give them, he wrote in a short story. Or as he turned 50, elders have become cheap to modern children, too readily accessible, and so have all objects of desire. And throughout his awareness of the divinely created cosmos, the world is an ever-changing foam that floats on the surface of a sea of silence. Or another quote, man has in him the silence of the sea, the noise of the earth, and the music of the air. W.B. Yeats, in his famous introduction to Gitanjali, quoted an anonymous Bengali doctor as saying, "We have other poets, but none that are as equal. We call this the epoch of Rabindranath. No poet seems to me as famous in Europe as he is amongst us. He's as great in music as in poetry, and his songs are sung from the west of India into Burma, wherever Bengali is spoken. He was already famous at 19 when he wrote his first novel, and plays when he was but little older and are still played in Calcutta. I so much admire the completeness of his life. When he was very young, he wrote much of the natural objects. He would sit all day in his garden, from his 25th year or so to his 35th perhaps. When he had a great sorrow, he wrote the most beautiful love poetry in our language. After that, his art grew deeper. It became religious and philosophical. All the inspiration of mankind are in his hymns. He is the first among our saints who has not refused to live, but has spoken out of life itself. And that is why we give him our love," unquote. Tagore returned the compliment in elegant terms, writing of Yeats, "Like a cut diamond that needs the light of the sky to show itself, the human soul on its own cannot express its essence and remains dark. Only when it reflects the light from something greater than itself does it come into its own." Yeats himself went on to observe, "These lyrics, which are in the original, my Indians tell me, full of subtlety of rhythm, of untranslatable delicacies of color, of metrical invention, display in their thought a world I have dreamed of all my life long. The work of a supreme culture, they yet appear as much the growth of the common soil as the grass and the rushes. A tradition where poetry and religion are the same thing has passed through the centuries, gathering from learned and unlearned metaphor and emotion, and carried back again to the multitude the thought of the scholar and of the noble," unquote. For Yeats, though, their Indian spiritual content was their principal value. Quote, "We fight and make money and fill our heads with politics, all dull things in the doing, while Mr. Tagore, like the Indian civilization itself, has been content to discover the soul and surrender himself to its spontaneity," unquote. Yeats. Again, Tagore himself would have disowned such grand claims. "Since it's impracticable to be uncivilized, I'd better try to be thoroughly civil," he wrote to his niece Indira. But admittedly, none of these distinctions, each rarer than the other, necessarily offer an adequate explanation for the question of why should Tagore matter today. Yes, there was a time when Tagore was a global phenomenon whose aura and impact was felt in places like Iran, where he was warmly received and celebrated by the Shah, South America, where he would go on to influence a young Pablo Neruda, the Argentine writer Victoria Ocampo, and the Brazilian poet Cecilia Meirelles, in China, Japan, Vietnam, Germany, Poland, many more countries. And he did so at a point in history where networks between these countries were at a nascent stage, and the idea of globalization buried in the fiery sarcophagus of the First World War. Yet there was a time when Tagore's reputation and international image were so greatly recognized that you even had a rather bizarre situation where dictators like Mussolini and Stalin vied with each other to have him visit their countries in the hope of securing a symbolic endorsement from his presence of their egregious regimes. But all that was a considerable while ago. a moment in history that shouldn't necessarily hold itself to special relevance for us in the 21st century. And it's also true that Tagore was not always welcomed by Asian modernists. On a visit to Shanghai in 1924, his message that modern civilization, built upon the cult of money and power, was inherently destructive and needed to be tempered by the spiritual wisdom of the East, while Western ideas of modernity should be regarded with skepticism, led to him being heckled and booed by Chinese audiences. The communist poet Zhu Juibai wrote, "Thank you, Mr. Tagore, but we have already had too many Confuciuses and Menciuses in China," unquote. And yet history has a way of repeating itself. And unless we learn from the past, the future remains unclear and challenging. As I've often said myself in another context, if you don't know where you're coming from, then how can you appreciate where you're going? Let us take a step back and look at the world in which Tagore made such an impact in the 1920s and 1930s, a period universally recognized for being one of the darkest points in human history, which ultimately concluded in the monstrosities of the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust and Hiroshima. Across Europe, the far right and its populist promises to restore the historic glory and grandeur of their respective countries was finding unprecedented acceptance in society. Winston Churchill, for instance, now hailed in the West as a standard bearer of democracy and freedom, was throughout the 1920s and early 1930s an open admirer of Mussolini, saying in the 1920s after visiting Italy that the Italian fascist movement had rendered a service to the whole world. Democracy was an idea that Europeans like Churchill were happy to discard in the heyday of fascism. When circumstances plunged him into being the standard bearer, hypocritically, of democracy and freedom, he embraced the public relations opportunity. But let us not forget that fascism had a much broader appeal in those days than is commonly realized. Tagore held fast to a soaring humanist vision at a time when borders were being flung up between men and nations and fetters placed on their imaginations and their tongues. Authoritarianism and colonialism placed jackboots on the necks of dissidents everywhere. Racism was reflexive for imperialists and augmented by anti-Semitism in Europe. Protectionism was at an all-time high, with countries looking inwards as they moved to recover from the structural changes forced upon them by the First World War. In America, the Great Depression had set in, leaving 34 million Americans with no income of their own, and across the world, a nativist xenophobia grew, based on an intrinsic distrust and organized hatred of anyone who was deemed an outsider. Fast forward to today, and the parallels between the two periods are grim, and offers a sobering reminder of the dangers of our times. Populist leaders or strongmen have resurfaced in Russia, China, Turkey, Philippines, across parts of Europe, till very recently in America, and of course here in India. The supranational institutions of global governance of the post-Bretton Woods era, the United Nations and its satellites like the WHO, the European Union, the IMF, and others are all facing internal crises of their own, brought about by the continual reluctance to accommodate structural reforms within them to reflect a changing world that has moved a long way since the bipolar Cold War order. Xenophobia and anti-Semitism are back in parts of the world that one would have thought would never entertain such ideas again. Protectionism, at least partly, has made a re-entry into global politics. And worryingly, anyone who is a Muslim, an immigrant, or worse still, a Muslim immigrant, is now looked at in parts of the world as a national security threat. As the British journalist Jonathan Freedland described the comparisons between the 1930s and the present, quote, "For historians of the period, the 1930s are always worthy of study because the decade proves that systems, including democratic republics, which it seems solid and robust, can collapse. That fate is possible even in advanced, sophisticated societies. The warning never gets old." The worldwide backlash against globalization is only likely to further accelerate in the post-COVID world. As I've argued, the signs that we are entering a fresh wave of deglobalization are mounting. All the evidence so far suggests that the world may embrace isolationism and protectionism in a far more enthusiastic way than prior to the outbreak, including in India. The pandemic has confirmed for many that in times of crisis, people rely on their own governments to shield them, that global supply chains are vulnerable to disruption and are therefore unsustainable, and that dependence on foreign countries for essential goods such as pharmaceuticals or even the ingredients that go into making them could be fatal. Nations have tried aggressively to acquire medicines and corner vaccine supplies for their own people at the expense of each other. There is a rush to reset global supply chains and raise trade barriers. The demand for more protectionism and self-reliance has been echoed in Mr. Modi's call for Atmanirbharta. At the same time, we're also contending with another byproduct of the backlash to globalization through the rise of mandatory patriotism, and at its heart, conformity as the new badge of allegiance. The global backlash against the forces that have defined the first decade and a half of the 21st century has taken on a nativist hue everywhere. In Europe and America, this has involved racist hostility to immigrants and minorities, whether ethnically or religiously defined. Since such negative messaging requires a positive counterpart, nationalism has filled the breach as a majoritarian narrative has sought to subsume each country's diverse political tendencies into an artificial mandated unity masquerading as authentically rooted patriotism. Democracy matters much less, it seems, than such litmus tests of nationalism. Globalization had promised a world of dissolving differences and ever-expanding freedoms that would embrace and include everyone. Instead, today's reactive nationalism heightens differences, emphasizes singular virtues associated with a politically defined people, and seeks to instill loyalty and commitment to the state and its emblems. At the level of voluntarily flaunting the national flag, the national anthem, the lapel pin like myself, reverence for the military sacrifices, I have no problem with this. But when these symbols are used to promote a sense of duty, rather than affection for the idea of the nation, and compliance with the prevailing governmental narrative rather than freedom for each citizen to interpret national loyalty in her own way, then I do have a problem. Thus, respect for the anthem and the flag becomes a code for obedience to the state and the ruling party. To put it plainly, conformity has now become the new litmus test, and this is something Tagore would have educated us to resist. These are all troubling and potentially dangerous developments. The idea of the nation as an inclusive community of all citizens, one that allows each individual to shelter under the constitutional carapace, to pursue his or her own ideas of happiness, free from the impositions of others, is being tossed aside in the name of a higher patriotic duty to an officially sanctioned version of nationalism. This is reminiscent of the same slippery slope down which Italy and Germany slid into fascism and Nazism in the 1920s and 1930s. Such fears may be exaggerated in today's democracies with modern means of communication and thriving free media, but complacency is no longer an option. Tagore foresaw and predicted the dangers of this narrow-minded nationalism and was perhaps one of the greatest critics of a phenomenon that he once described as a cruel epidemic of evil that is sweeping over the human world, eating into its moral vitality. It's safe to assume that Tagore's principled opposition to nationalism came from a perspective tempered by the experiences of the First World War and the nationalistic fervor that had gripped much of Europe and led to violence of a magnitude the world had never seen before. In a three-part essay that forms his magisterial work, Nationalism, Tagore, writing at a time when war was raging across Europe, offered a prescient warning of the dangers of nationalism and the nation state. Quote, "When this organization of politics and commerce, whose other name is the nation, becomes all powerful at the cost of the harmony of the higher social life, then it is an evil day for humanity. When a father becomes a gambler and his obligations to his family take the secondary place in his mind, then he's no longer a man, but an automaton but an automaton led by the power of greed. Then he can do things which in his normal state of mind he would be ashamed to do. It is the same thing with society. When it allows itself to be turned into a perfect organization of power, then there are few crimes which it is unable to perpetrate, unquote. To Tagore, quote, the idea of the nation is one of the most powerful anesthetics that man has invented. Under the influence of its fumes, he wrote, the whole people can carry out its systematic program of the most virulent self-seeking without being in the least aware of its moral perversion, unquote. That moral perversion, Tagore argued, was the immoral idea that one set of people, constituted as a nation in one place, was somehow more significant, more important, more powerful than, and therefore superior to, another set of people constituted as a separate nation somewhere else. Such ideas emerge from the very basic idea of a national purpose. The nationalist sees his own as the ultimate nation. Any who disagree, whether because of ideology, religion, ethnicity, or simply because they belong to another nation, are opposed and have to be put down. In Tagore's words, whether through falsehood or error, we have to prove our own superiority to ourselves, and in the process, denigrate other nations. Ultimately, to Tagore, the moral imperative of humanity far outweighed the political and commercial impetus that came together to form the core of nationalism as he saw it. To him, nationalism was a distraction from the real problems of humanity, which he felt were social. To him, nationalistic fervor had come to a stage where the moral man, the complete man, is more and more giving way, almost without knowing it, to make room for the political man, the commercial man, the man of the limited purpose. This, aided by the wonderful progress in science, is assuming gigantic proportion and power, causing the upset of man's moral balance, obscuring his human side under the shadow of soulless organization, unquote. As was often the case with Tagore, he captures this warning better and most beautifully in his poem, The Sunset of the Century, which he wrote on the last day of the 19th century. And I read the poem. The last sun of the century sets amidst the blood-red clouds of the west and the whirlwind of hatred. The naked passion of self-love of nations, in its drunken delirium of greed, is dancing to the clash of steel and the howling verses of vengeance. The hungry self of the nation shall burst in a violence of fury from its own shameless feeding, for it has made the world its food. The crimson glow of light on the horizon is not the light of thy dawn of peace, my motherland. It is the glimmer of the funeral pyre, burning to ashes the vast flesh, the self-love of the nation, dead under its own excess. Thy morning waits behind the patient dark of the east, meek and silent. That's the sunset of the century. It was almost as if he was thinking of today's world when he wrote this poem with his clarion call to beware the dangers of jingoism and chauvinism, cloaked under the garb of the love of one's nation. But this is not to say Tagore wasn't a patriot. He would eventually return his knighthood to the British in protest to the massacre of peaceful Indian protesters at Jallianwala Bagh by General Dyer, an act that would lead Indians to regard Tagore as a great hero of the national struggle. Tagore wrote that he could not retain such an honor in the incongruous context of national humiliation. At the same time, in a letter to C.F. Andrews in 1920, Tagore would admit, quote, "It is not that I do not feel anger in my heart for injustice and insult heaped upon my motherland, but this anger of mine should be turned into the fire of love for lighting the lamp of worship to be dedicated through my country to my God. It would be an insult to humanity if I use the sacred energy of my moral indignation for the purpose of spreading a blind passion all over my country," unquote. So Tagore did not really believe in nationalism, but in the values of the human spirit, transcending all national boundaries. My religion, he told Albert Einstein, is in the reconciliation of the superpersonal man, the universal human spirit in my own individual being. He had little patience for parochial forms of thinking. Our mind has faculties which are universal, he declared, but its habits are insular. In his book Nationalism, he expressed the view that there is only one history, the history of man. All national histories are merely chapters in the larger one. National pride does not feature in his thought only the immutable goals of knowledge, learning, and the pursuit of truth. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action. Into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. Typically, Tagore's is an inspirational poem that could serve as the anthem for any nation seeking freedom, while giving no indulgence whatsoever to jingoism or chauvinism. For the chauvinist glee with which I, as an Indian writer, am celebrating Rabindranath Tagore, would not particularly have appealed to him. He dreamt of freedom for India, but it was not merely freedom from foreign rule that he sought for his countrymen. It was in a place where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, and where the mind is led forward into ever-widening thought and action, that Tagore hoped his India would awake to freedom. Indeed, his idea of freedom was far more profoundly individual than national. Freedom of movement is not the only vital liberty, he said in 1916. Freedom of work is still more important. Nor is subjugation the greatest bondage. Narrowness of opportunity is the worst cage of all. One of his poems, a very short poem, perfectly captures the paradox of the nature of personal freedom in an enslaved land. The tame bird was in a cage, the free bird was in the forest. They met when the time came, it was a decree of fate. The free bird cries, "Oh, my love, let us fly to the wood." The cage bird whispers, "Come hither, let us both live in the cage." Says the free bird, "Among bars, where is the room to spread one's wings?" "Alas," cries the caged bird, "I should not know where to sit, perched in the sky." So Tagore's was a voice of freedom, that it was more important to him that every individual be free to pursue his destiny. Give me the strength never to bend my knees before insolent might, he prayed in Gitanjali. As a result, he was an iconoclast, dissenting not only from empire, but even from the political orthodoxies of his own country's struggle for independence. Perhaps in this context, his disagreements with Mahatma Gandhi are not so surprising. He objected to the Mahatma's non-cooperation movement on what one might term philosophical grounds. He considered it political asceticism, and asceticism was not something of which he approved. No, in its passive moral form, is asceticism, and in its active moral form is violence, he argued in a letter to the Mahatma's British associate Dinbandhu C.F. Andrews. Nor did he have much patience for the Mahatma's method of fasting unto death. Fasting, which has no direct action upon the conduct of misdoers, he wrote to Gandhiji in 1933, and which may abruptly terminate one's power further to serve those who need help, is all the more unacceptable for any individual who has the responsibility to represent humanity. Gandhiji was not convinced, but their exchanges are amongst the most stimulating intellectual pleasures of the freedom movement. At the same time, Tagore was not exactly an internationalist in the classic sense, beloved of UN aficionados like myself. He died before the United Nations was created, but he did not think highly of its forerunner organization, the League of Nations. Tagore wrote of the League that it was well conceived in theory, but not in practice, because it was an institution in which the world was represented by national governments and nationalist political leaders. It is, he wrote, like organizing a band of robbers into a police department. There is no reason to believe he would have felt any differently about today's UN, which is also an organization of states rather than of peoples. When he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, his acceptance speech, read out at the grand official banquet by the British Chargé d'Affaires in Norway, consisted of one sentence. Quote, "I beg to convey to the Swedish Academy my grateful appreciation of the breadth of understanding which has brought the distant near and has made a stranger a brother," unquote. That was his entire Nobel speech. But Tagore did propagate something much more powerful than internationalism, as defined in the sense of global governance, or even globalization as is understood and attacked today. What Tagore promoted was a moral synthesis between the West and the East, at a time when it seemed that the world was falling apart at its seams. This at a time when the West, with its imperial ambitions and colonial legacy, was looked at with much resentment in the East, and for Tagore to try and establish a moral commonality between the two was no simple task. But Tagore was quick to point out that even within the West, a distinction must be drawn between the spirit of the West and the nation of the West. To him, the spirit represented the moral convictions of Western society, what he categorized as its best contributions to humanity, from internationalism to the idea of rights-based democracy, to a focus on education and social development and so on. These were universal values that would go a long way to furthering the overall development of humanity. In stark contrast to this was the nation of the West, a structure that was motivated by greed and self-interest, which used the tools of imperialism and colonialism to promote its malicious interests in heartless fashion. Speaking on the Indian experience under the British, Tagore pointed out that but this desire for a common bond of comradeship among the different races of India has been the work of the spirit of the West, not that of the nation of the West. Wherever in Asia the people have received the true lesson of the West, it is in spite of the Western nation, nation with a capital N. And with his long beard and his flowing white robe, Rabindranath Tagore epitomized for many the archetype of the Indian sage, the precursor of so many godmen and gurus who have followed his footsteps to the West. There is little doubt that his magisterial mind and his authoritative presence did a great deal to inspire admiration across the world and to spark a revival of interest in India, in Hinduism, and in the teachings of Hindu spirituality. Tagore's Hinduism had little to do with the Hindu-ness sought to be promoted by today's Hindutva brigades. It was a faith free of the restrictive dogma of Holy Writ, untrammeled in its yearning for the divine, and universalist in its conception and its appeal. This is what made his ideas so attractive to non-Indians. He had a great respect for Christianity, which he saw as emerging in many ways from Asia. "I think it has been the good fortune of the West," he wrote, "to have the opportunity of absorbing the spirit of the East through the medium of the Bible." Tagore undoubtedly had a profound respect for the importance of syncretic relationships between peoples and placed the value of this far beyond the limitations of artificial barriers. He was the voice that coined the memorable phrase "unity in diversity," that would go on to form the bedrock of our democratic ethos, even if it has now become somewhat of a cliche. "The sole effort of India," Tagore wrote, "has always been to establish unity in diversity, to direct many paths to the same end, and to perceive the one in the many profoundly and unambiguously." This rested on the acknowledgement of a deep-rooted underlying desire for harmony, despite India's vast heterogeneity, heterodoxy, and plurality. This was true well before independence and crystallized in opposition to the foreign imperium. As he memorably invoked in the Gitanjali, I'll quote again briefly from a poem, "Here came Aryans, non-Aryans, Dravids and Mongols, tribes of Scythians and Huns, Pathans and Mughals. In one body they merged, and finally they came to take and will stay to give, but they will never leave Bharat, the seashore of humanity." So that's again from Tagore, and it's interesting that in his famous discovery of India, India's first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, fittingly acknowledged Tagore's contributions, noting that more than any other Indian, he had helped to bring into harmony the ideals of the East and West and broaden the basis of Indian nationalism. He has been India's internationalist par excellence, believing and working for international cooperation, taking India's message to other countries and bringing their messages to his own people. As the historian Ramachandra Guha points out, when Nehru became Prime Minister in 1947, the influence of Tagore was quite strong in the direction Nehru chose to take the country. Tagore's ideas of a synthesis between tradition and modernity, between the West and India, was a guiding philosophy for Nehru as well, as evident in his efforts to keep India non-aligned during the Cold War era and to promote Pan-Asianism amongst India and its neighbors. Tagore was unusual in stretching his imagination to Africa, the title of one of his lesser-known poems, in which mystical imagery is married to a denunciation of colonialism. Yes, from Africa. Alas, O veiled one, underneath the obscurity of your dark facade lay unknown your human identity, degraded by the collective gaze of derision. And then they arrived manacles in hand, claws sharper by far than any on your wolves. They arrived human rustlers and traffickers all, by vanity and arrogance blinded, sightless by far than your darkest sunless forests. If Tagore, the man of sophisticated political, educational, and spiritual ideas, has dominated this lecture, it would be wrong to omit the other Tagore, the author of some of the finest love poems and songs ever written. My personal favorite is one that I read to my late wife upon our engagement, and I will embarrass myself by repeating it here, for it is too good to omit from any depiction of Tagore's mind. I seem to have loved you in numberless forms, numberless times, in life after life, in age after age, forever. My spellbound heart has made and remade the necklace of songs that you take as a gift, wear round your neck in your many forms, in life after life, in age after age, forever. Whenever I hear old chronicles of love, its age-old pain, its ancient tale of being apart or together, as I stare on and on into the past, in the end you emerge, clad in the light of a star, piercing the darkness of time. You become an image of what is remembered forever. You and I have floated here on the stream that brings from the fount at the heart of time love of one for another. We have played alongside millions of lovers, shared in the same shy sweetness of meeting, the same distressful tears of farewell. All love, but in shapes that renew and renew forever. Today it is heaped at your feet. It has found its end in you, the love of all man's days, both past and forever. Universal joy, universal sorrow, universal life, the memories of all loves merging with this one love of ours, and the songs of every poet, past and forever. When the great British poet Wilfred Owen, author of the greatest anti-war poem in the English language, Dulce Decorum Est, was to return to the front to give his life in the futile First World War, he recited Tagore's parting words to his mother as his last goodbye. When he was so tragically and pointlessly killed, Owen's mother found Tagore's poem copied out in her son's hand in his diary. When I go from hence, let this be my parting word, that what I have seen is unsurpassable. I have tasted of the hidden honey of this lotus that expands on the ocean of light, and thus am I blessed. Let this be my parting word. In this playhouse of infinite forms, I've had my play, and here have I caught sight of him that is formless. My whole body and my limbs have thrilled with his touch, who is beyond touch. And if the end comes here, let it come. Let this be my parting word. And yet this magnificent wheeler of words spoke modestly of the value of poetry. Words are barren, dismal, and uninspiring by themselves, he said in a 1922 lecture. But when they are bound together by some bond of rhythm, they attain their significance as a reality which can be described as creative. The universality of Tagore's vision, his thoughts and ideas seem to me beyond cavil, and his fears for the direction of the modern world as prescient then and as applicable today as when he first expressed them. With his typical generosity, Tagore said of the artist William Rothenstein, his friend, he had the vision to see truth and the heart to love it. The same was true of himself. Rabindranath Tagore would have won immortality in any of his chosen fields. Instead, he remains immortal in all. Namaskar and Jai Hind.
Thank you. I have to tell you that that entire talk that we heard just now, instead of being delivered live, we had to record it yesterday because Dr. Tharoor is still recovering from COVID, and he did not feel that his health would enable him to do the lecture live. As it happens, he has joined us today from his bed to be part of the discussion because he was assigned to bed rest after yesterday. I just wish to thank him for this real commitment, insisting on keeping his word and being part of this. Thank you. Before I invite Sri Debashis Sen as our special discussant to make a few comments on what we've just heard Tharoor delivered today, then we'll move on to questions and answers from the audience.
Mr. Tharoor, it
Mr.
is
Sen.
always a great experience listening to you, and your choice of words, language, and the passion that you put in. All your TED Talks I have heard, and I'm a great fan of yours. Today's was no exception. And when you start and link with Choturango and today's COVID, and I hope you'll get well soon also, that brings the relevance of Tagore in today's modern world. It was a splendid discussion going through the Second World War, modernity, Gandhi, Tagore talks, and Albert Einstein and Tagore talks. It was wonderful listening to you. I will take just 2 points from what you said and seek a bit of thought on what you would say to it. You have already mentioned about globalization and how Tagore dreamt of it. But the more we see the modern world, not only in India, you have touched the Indian context very well, but also the international context. There's Brexit, there's a breaking up of the union, and just before in the US, everything seems to be so protectionist. My question is, do you think Tagore would be unhappy to wake up suddenly in this world because his idea of one nation, no state nations would have fallen apart? The second and short question that I am quite curious about, and if you would like to make some comments upon it, I know that Tagore had seen death in very close quarters. He lost his wife, he lost his sons, he lost while he was still alive. And he is known to have commented that seeing death from so close quarters, passing away of the near ones, is such a tragic eventuality that all of us will have to bear. Looking at whatever Tagore says, including Jokhon porben amor payer chinno ei pate, when my footsteps will not be seen in this world, what will happen? I would like you to say how Tagore, especially in his final days, looked at death. Did he really believe in an afterlife? Did he really thought that this was as good as living? Your thoughts, Mr. Tharoor.
Thank you very much, Debashis, and thank you for the kind words about my speeches. As Anjum mentioned, I'm not in the best shape. I'll keep my answers brief, but I do want to say that it was a pleasure addressing this hugely important subject. On the question of whether Tagore would have been unhappy in today's world, I'm not sure, because the world that we are in today was also the world of his lifetime. The world was divided into nation states. And therefore, he was a dreamer who dreamt of a better world, In a sense, he was sort of the literary, poetic equivalent of the John Lennon Imagine ballad. He was imagining a world that would be better than the one we were all living in. But I think for him to be unhappy would have been meant being unrealistic. I think he saw the entire world as his, and he would have continued, probably welcoming the opportunity to travel so easily. Think of all those months he spent on steamer ships going to Latin America and Japan and so on. Now that he could jet around the world, he might have got to a lot more countries and actually made the impact he did. As for death, I don't think he was afraid of death. I don't know that he necessarily believed in an afterlife, but he certainly saw death as a I think in one of his poems he has this line about it's essentially shutting down the lamp because dawn has come. I'm misremembering the exact words. Unlike you, who can quote him so well in Bangla, I have to quote him in English. But
Yeah, that's right.
the idea that there is an awakening, that it's something to be embraced, something to even look forward to. I don't think that he was at all worried or intimidated by the prospect of death. And he had, I think, accomplished so much. One could argue that though he kept up his pace till the very last few months, there was no real pending project that he left unfulfilled, no triumph remaining for him to get. He was turning 80, and in those days, 80 was a lot older than it is today. I don't really think he had many more expectations of life. So to that degree, I don't think that death came to him as pain or sorrow. He embraced it, and we don't know what he found afterwards, but he would have looked forward to what he was going to find, as he said, when the dawn came.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anything further, Mr. Sen, or shall we move on to
No,
audience
please
questions?
move. I had these
Thank
two
you.
questions and very well answered, I think.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have an anonymous attendee who wants to know, Mr. Tharoor, Dr. Tharoor, what's the device which was hanging around your collar? Was that a
This one right
vintage
here.
mobile phone?
It looks like a vintage mobile phone, but it's actually an air purifier. It's a portable a personal air purifier, which blasts negative ions around you, and hopefully it does me some good. But I don't know. And it's one is taking it on the principle that at least it can't do any harm. So I wear it around my neck. It's called Air Tamer, and it's not difficult to get online.
Right. So that should be. Are you feeling up to taking a few more questions, or
Sure. I'd be
because
happy
there?
to take a few
Yeah.
more. Absolutely. And I
Okay.
just noticed in the chat room that Sudeshna Sengupta has come up with the right quote. Death is not extinguishing the light. It is only putting out the lamp because the dawn has
Oh,
come. That was
wow.
what I didn't put it quite so perfectly, but that was exactly the idea. Putting out the lamp because the dawn has come.
Beautiful idea, as you said.
Beautiful
Metaphors
idea,
are
yes.
always stunning. So Monojit Pal has a question. Tagore's far-sighted political vision, defined by an inclusive global humanism and an urgent thrust on interfaith, international amity, becomes all the more relevant for the world. Unfortunately, our current leadership has not envisioned these values. You've already spoken about this, I think, in the course of your talk. So it's more or less repeating that. Should we move on to the next question?
Sure. I think
Which
the answer is
is,
very clear that the world is indefinitely and in the lifetimes of everyone listening today is bound to be made up of sovereign states. No one is going to be willing to give up their sovereignty in a hurry.
right, okay. So shall we move on to the next question? This is from Debabrata Mukhopadhyay. Unity in diversity and crisis of civilization and Gitanjali. Are these, in your opinion, the pivots of Tagore philosophy?
Well, his philosophy was more than that. I mean, as I mentioned in my talk, it embraced the political and the geopolitical, and certainly his passionate views on nationalism, which would undoubtedly attract attract the zealots in our present ruling establishment who like to slap sedition cases on people who have such dangerous ideas, would mean that I think Tagore's views on nationalism would not have been welcome at all. But he also had ideas and philosophical thoughts about everything else, about life, about love, about yearning for the divine, about culture, about literature and the value of ideas. He had so many that it would be wrong, I think, to confine him just to the elements mentioned in the question, because while those were important, he really had a very capacious view of the world, which he articulated in so many multiple forms, as I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, that you really see Tagore as somebody whose philosophy was humanistic in the broadest possible sense of the term, embracing
Right.
all aspects of human life. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we go on to another question by Adrit Banerjee. Amartya Sen in Tagore and His India says, the question he, Tagore, persistently asks is whether we have reason enough to want what is being proposed, taking everything into account. How much do you think in today's India and the world is this voice of reasoning important? And how do Tagore's thoughts show us the way forward?
It's undoubtedly greatly important. We've seen this in the whole battle against COVID, where the failure to think and behave scientifically, the willingness to go in for quack remedies, the failure to plan, to organize ourselves rationally, have caused tremendous tragedy all around the country. So it would be foolish of us to overlook the need for more rational, reasoned, and scientific approaches to our current predicament. To that degree, there's absolutely no doubt that that's very, very important. But again, Tagore, because he was a poet, because he was the kind of thinker he was, could also think beyond the rational. I mean, there's a lot of what Yeats called mysticism in his understanding of the world, which obviously goes beyond that which is rationally understood or explicable. You see this particularly in his poetry, not at all in his plays, not much in his fiction, but certainly in his poetry. And I think, therefore, to put Tagore purely and firmly and exclusively in the camp of the rationalists would not be right. He was very much in favor of reasoned and rational thinking, but he had room, I would argue, for a more broad, shall we say, metaphysical view of human needs and yearnings.
Okay, thank you very much. There was one question from a student of class 12. I can't resist that.
Yes, he asks about the thin line between nationalism and xenophobia, and hatred of the foreigner, which could later turn into a hatred of Indians different from oneself. I think that's an incredibly important idea of Tagore's. I've mentioned it, in fact, in my book, The Battle of Belonging, that the great danger with that kind of thinking is precisely this, that if it is people like us united in the concept of an exclusive nationalism, the process of excluding others can extend, it seems to me, beyond the others defined by passport or national borders into other kinds of otherness, whether it is religion, whether it is region, whether it is language, whether it's caste. And Tagore was very conscious of that. Tagore, he was all embracing in his ideas of humanity. Of course, he was accused by some of the Chinese communists in particular of being a little too proud of Eastern philosophy, mysticism, spiritualism, and so on, which the Chinese communists was trying to discard in their own country. And so they shall we say, criticized him for taking a stand which they felt was passé in terms of their needs. But I think that this is not just a timeless concern. it is particularly relevant today. And we are seeing in our own country and in other countries how the affirmation of some sort of authentically rooted nationalism by various leaders always seems to involve the exclusion of others, whether it is Make America Great Again, which seems to come at the expense of Black people, whether it is the rejection of East Europeans or pretty much any foreigner speaking any languages other than English in the Brexit campaign, whether it is the French movement against Muslims and North Africans, and whether it is what we're seeing in our own country, where the demonization of Muslims in particular, and indeed of other minorities generally, has been a tragic concomitant of those who have tried to articulate a Hindutva version of nationalism. So I would agree entirely with the young Arman Mathur of class 12 that what he is saying is a very valid concern, that Tagore had anticipated, that that he, in rejecting all sorts of xenophobia, also rejected the othering of our own neighbors. And it's striking. You see this repeatedly in his stories as well, how he would depict people from other communities, other castes, and so on, who were actually given the attention and concern of the protagonists because it was the right thing to do. Chotorongo itself has this particular episode we've talked about, because the tanners are essentially Muslims, and they are there, and he refuses to leave them behind, stays, and he's engulfed by the horror. But it's the right thing to do from Tagore's point of view, because your service to your fellow human being has to look beyond the distinctions that separate you, whether class or caste or religion or language or anything else. Those have to be overcome if you really want to go beyond the narrower kinds of bigoted thinking that people are capable of. So, well done, young man. This is indeed an important insight, and let's hope that as you grow up into an India where intolerance has acquired respectability, that you too will speak up in Tagore's terms for an India where we're not divided by these narrow domestic walls.
Thank you very much, Shashi. I really can't thank you enough. I think I speak on behalf of all of us for being such a, what should I say, such a brick for really just doing this and not backing out of it due to ill health. Just sincerely wish you a speedy recovery so that you 100% back to your full health, and may that happen soon. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. It's been good to be with all of you, and thank you for this wonderful platform. All the best.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you so much, Shashi. That was absolutely riveting. Thank you for being with us.